The Hegemony Institute of Universal Physics had stood as the galaxy's premier center of scientific learning for precisely 4,732 standard galactic years. Not that anyone was counting, of course, except for the obsessively precise crystalline archive keepers, who maintained records of everything down to the exact nanosecond of each quantum fluctuation. The Institute's towering spires of polished neutronium gleamed against the binary sunset of Academica Prime, each surface etched with mathematical equations so fundamental that merely reading them was said to grant enlightenment to lesser species. Professor Zenthal 9, the Institute's most distinguished theoretical physicist and holder of 17 advanced degrees in impossible mathematics, adjusted his primary sensory apparatus and gazed with satisfaction across the grand lecture hall. His six-armed form radiated the kind of smug intellectual superiority that only came from having spent the last 3 centuries explaining the universe to beings who barely understood antimatter. The hall's crystalline walls hummed with the gentle vibration of contained dark energy, a reminder that here, within these hallowed chambers, the very forces of creation bent to academic authority. "Colleagues," Zenthal 9 announced to the assembled faculty, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic certainty, "today marks another glorious achievement in our eternal quest to catalog every possible violation of natural law." The assembled professors, a collection of beings so intellectually advanced they had transcended the need for consistent physical forms, rippled with polite academic applause. There was Helix Prime, whose consciousness existed as a sentient probability cloud. Professor Graviton, whose mass was so perfectly calibrated she could demonstrate space-time curvature by simply existing, and the venerable Dr. Quantum Flux, who had achieved tenure by successfully explaining why nothing could travel faster than light to over 40 different species. The Institute prided itself on its comprehensive understanding of universal constants. Every force, every particle, every possible interaction had been catalogued, measured and filed away in the Department of Absolute Certainty. The speed of light was not merely a suggestion, it was the law, carved into the fabric of reality itself and defended by peer review. Conservation of energy was not just a guideline, it was sacred doctrine, protected by the combined intellectual might of the galaxy's finest minds. And causality? Well, causality was so obviously inviolable that questioning it was grounds for immediate expulsion from academic circles, which made the recent discovery of humanity particularly problematic. The first reports had trickled in through the usual diplomatic channels. A new species had achieved interstellar travel. Nothing unusual there. The galaxy welcomed new members with the same enthusiasm reserved for tax audit. What raised eyebrows or equivalent sensory organs was the method of their arrival. According to the patrol fleet's sensor logs, the human vessel had simply appeared in the Centauri system without any detectable faster-than-light signature, energy discharge or dimensional fold distortion. It had just shown up, like a dinner guest arriving fashionably late to a party no one remembered inviting them to. The subsequent investigation had yielded data that made grown physicists weep into their probability matrices. The human ship appeared to operate on principles that existed in a cheerful state of contradiction with everything the Institute held dear. Their engines produced thrust without expelling reaction mass. Their computers processed information faster than quantum entanglement should allow, and their artificial gravity worked by mechanisms that made senior faculty members break out in existential rashes. Professor Zenthal 9 had personally reviewed the technical specifications 3 times, each reading more disturbing than the last. The humans had achieved what the Institute's finest minds declared impossible. They had built a civilization on the foundation of physics that simply refused to cooperate with established theory. Their energy production violated thermodynamics so casually it seemed almost rude. Their communication systems ignored the inverse square law with the same nonchalant disregard most species reserved for parking regulations. But the real insult to academic dignity came when the human diplomatic team arrived for formal first contact. The delegation consisted of exactly one individual, a female engineer, whose credentials listed her highest education as night school, and whose primary qualification was apparently good with machine. She wore simple coveralls, carried a toolkit that seemed to violate several conservation laws just by existing, and displayed the kind of cheerful competence that made professional academics break out in nervous sweat. During the initial technology exchange, she had casually mentioned that their faster-than-light communication worked by asking the universe nicely, and that their energy problems had been solved by convincing atoms to be more cooperative. When pressed for technical details, she had shrugged and explained that the theory was probably complicated, but the practice was simple enough that children learned it in basic engineering classes. The assembled faculty of the institute had watched in growing horror as she demonstrated what she called standard human engineering practices. She had fixed a malfunctioning quantum resonator by talking to it encouragingly and giving it a gentle percussive maintenance task. She had improved the efficiency of a fusion reactor by rearranging the magnetic containment fields into what she claimed was a prettier pattern. Most disturbing of all, she had solved a complex dark matter interaction problem by simply asking the dark matter to please behave itself for a few minutes. Each demonstration had been accompanied by the kind of casual commentary that suggested humans viewed the fundamental forces of the universe as mildly temperamental employees who occasionally needed guidance rather than immutable laws governing all existence. The engineers spoke of gravity as if it were a friend who sometimes got moody, described electromagnetic radiation as pretty reliable once you get to know it, and treated quantum mechanics like a household pet that occasionally needed training. The worst part from the Institute's perspective was that it worked. Every impossible thing the human did produced the expected results with the kind of reliability that made their carefully constructed theoretical frameworks look like elaborate philosophical exercise. The universe seemed to respond to human engineering with the eager compliance of a student trying to impress a favorite teacher. Professor Zinthal 9 had called an emergency session of the faculty council, where the galaxy's greatest minds had engaged in what historians would later describe as the most dignified academic panic attack in recorded history. The discussion had lasted 47 hours, and covered everything from fundamental force revision to the possibility that reality itself might be malfunctioning. Several junior professors had required therapy after witnessing equations they had spent decades perfecting become obsolete in real time. The unanimous conclusion was both simple and terrifying. Humans had somehow evolved in a universe where the laws of physics were more like guidelines, and they had never bothered to learn that such things were supposed to be impossible. They had developed technology that treated conservation of energy like a friendly suggestion, and causality like an optional courtesy. Most disturbing of all, the universe seemed perfectly happy to accommodate their casual disregard for cosmic order, which led to the faculty council's official resolution. If humanity insisted on ignoring proper physics, then the institute would simply have to educate. Surely, once they understood the correct way to interact with fundamental forces, they would abandon their primitive methods and embrace proper scientific protocol. After all, how difficult could it be to teach a species that had accidentally transcended the known laws of nature to respect the boundaries of possibility? The irony of the situation was lost on precisely no one except the distinguished faculty of the Hegemony Institute of Universal Physics, who were far too busy preparing lecture materials to notice they were about to attempt the academic equivalent of teaching water to flow up. The stage was set for what would become known throughout galactic history as the most spectacular failure of education theory ever recorded. The human engineer arrived at the Institute 3 standard days later aboard what the harbor master's log diplomatically recorded as a vessel of uncertain geometric classification. The ship defied every known principle of aerodynamics by having roughly the same streamlined efficiency as a flying brick, yet somehow managed to dock with all the grace of a master pilot, and none of the physics that should have made such maneuvering possible. The harbor master, a methodical Trilonian with 3 centuries of docking experience, had given up trying to calculate the craft's approach vector, and simply accepted that humans apparently navigated by wishful thinking. Professor Zinthal 9 had prepared extensively for this educational opportunity. His lesson plan covered the fundamentals of universal constant, beginning with basic concepts like why faster-than-light travel requires infinite energy, and progressing through conservation laws are not suggestions, to the advanced topic of how reality maintains its structural integrity through mathematical principle. Each lecture had been carefully crafted to guide the primitive human mind from ignorance to enlightenment, through the proven pedagogical methods that had successfully educated 47 different species over the millennia. The fundamental physics auditorium had been specially prepared for the occasion. Every equation that governed universal behavior had been inscribed in letters of pure energy across the walls, creating a learning environment so saturated with scientific truth that merely standing within it was said to increase one's understanding of cosmic law by measurable degrees. The demonstration equipment included working models of black holes, antimatter containment fields, and a scale replica of the galactic core's gravitational dynamics. Nothing had been left to chance in this comprehensive educational undertaking. The engineer entered the auditorium with the same casual stride she might use for a neighborhood grocery store, completely immune to the overwhelming display of cosmic academia surrounding her. She wore the same practical coveralls from the diplomatic meeting, carried the same impossible toolkit, and radiated the same cheerful competence that had initially charmed and subsequently terrified the Institute's finest mind. Her greeting consisted of a friendly wave and an observation that the classroom looked pretty fancy for a physics lesson. Professor Zinthal 9 began with what he considered a masterpiece of elementary education: the relationship between mass, energy, and the speed of light. His holographic displays showed elegant mathematical derivations. His voice carried the authority of absolute certainty, and his presentation included interactive demonstrations that had never failed to inspire awe in previous students. The equation EEMC core appeared in letters of fire above the auditorium, accompanied by a symphony of cosmic background radiation arranged in harmonic frequencies. The human listened politely, nodding at appropriate intervals and occasionally making encouraging sounds that suggested comprehension. However, her attention seemed somewhat divided by the task of fixing what appeared to be a broken quantum field generator she had pulled from her toolkit. While Professor Zinthal 9 explained why massive objects could not exceed light speed without infinite energy input, she was casually overclocking the generator's temporal matrix by humming a tune that somehow synchronized with its quantum frequency. The fundamental barrier, Professor Zinthal 9 continued with growing confidence, is that approaching light speed causes relativistic mass increase, which requires exponentially greater energy input, making faster than light travel mathematically impossible for any object with rest. He gestured grandly at the equations filling the air around them, each symbol representing millennia of careful theoretical development. The human engineer looked up from her work with the expression of someone trying to be helpful. "Oh, that's why our ships don't technically travel faster than light," she said cheerfully. "We just convince space to get smaller in front of us, and bigger behind us." Much more polite than bullying the universe into submission. As she spoke, the quantum field generator in her hands began operating at efficiency levels that violated several conservation laws and emitted a soft humming sound that made the auditorium's safety systems question their own existence. Professor Graviton, attending as a guest lecturer, materialized more solidly than usual in her distress. "But space is not elastic in that manner," she protested, her carefully modulated mass creating gravitational ripples that spelled out mathematical proofs in the local spacetime. "The metric tensor does not permit arbitrary manipulation without massive energy expenditure." "Well, sure," the engineer agreed amicably, "if you ask it rudely." She made a small adjustment to the field generator that somehow made it more efficient than thermodynamically possible. "But if you explain that you're in a hurry and promise to put everything back when you're done, space is usually pretty accommodating. It's all about cosmic manners." The assembled faculty exchanged glances that conveyed the kind of academic horror usually reserved for discovering that a century of research had been based on a calculation error. Dr. Quantum Flux, whose existence depended on maintaining strict uncertainty principles, began flickering between states of being as his foundational beliefs wavered. Professor Zinthal 9, determined to restore order to his carefully planned lesson, moved on to the topic of energy conservation. His next demonstration showed the absolute impossibility of creating energy from nothing, complete with mathematical proofs that had been peer-reviewed by every major scientific institution in the galaxy. The holographic display created a sealed system where energy could be tracked through every transformation, proving beyond doubt that the total remained constant. The human engineer watched with genuine interest, while absent-mindedly adjusting something in her toolkit that began producing more energy than it consumed. "That's really neat," she commented. "We used to worry about energy conservation too, until our kids figured out how to ask nicely for a bit extra when needed. Turns out the universe keeps a lot in reserve for emergency." The device in her hands was now outputting approximately 3 times the energy input, creating a small but measurable violation of thermodynamics that made the auditorium's monitoring systems emit increasingly frantic warning chimes. Several junior faculty members had begun taking notes with the desperate intensity of academics watching their life's work crumble in real time. But that's impossible," stammered Assistant Professor Helium Core, whose gaseous composition was beginning to show signs of agitation. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. This is fundamental law. Oh, absolutely. The engineer agreed, making another small adjustment that somehow convinced the device to operate in harmony with 17 different universal constants simultaneously. We're not creating energy, just borrowing a bit from the universe's credit system. We always pay it back eventually, usually with interest. The cosmos appreciates good financial responsibility. The quantum field generator was now functioning as what could only be described as a perpetual motion machine, except that it was also improving the local gravitational constant and making the nearby spacetime more aesthetically pleasing. Professor Zinthal 9 felt his carefully constructed worldview developing stress fractures that threatened to collapse his entire understanding of existence. By the time the lunch break arrived, the human engineer had inadvertently demonstrated that conservation of energy was more of a gentle guideline, that causality was surprisingly flexible when approached with proper etiquette, and that the speed of light was apparently willing to negotiate under the right circumstance. She had done all of this while maintaining the cheerful demeanor of someone helping a friend move furniture, useful, practical, and completely unaware that she was systematically demolishing the theoretical foundations of galactic civilization. Professor Zinthal 9 watched her leave for the cafeteria, still carrying the impossible quantum field generator that hummed contentedly as it continued violating fundamental laws with the persistence of a clock keeping time. Behind her, the Grand Lecture Hall's monitoring systems had given up trying to calculate the energy balance, and had begun displaying error messages in languages that had not been invented yet. The afternoon session would cover the immutable laws of thermodynamics, assuming the Institute's faculty could recover from watching their morning's lesson in absolute certainty transform into an educational disaster of cosmic proportion. The engineer had promised to return promptly after lunch, mentioning something about wanting to learn more about proper physics, while unconsciously adjusting her toolkit in ways that made several nearby fundamental constants nervous. Outside the auditorium windows, the binary sunset painted the neutronium spires in shades of gold and crimson, the same magnificent display that had inspired countless generations of galactic scholars to reach for absolute truth. The irony that this truth might be far more flexible than anyone had imagined hung in the air like a cosmic joke waiting for its punchline.
The Emergency Faculty Council session convened in the Institute's most secure conference chamber, a room lined with reality stabilizers and equipped with enough backup physics to maintain local universal constants, even if the surrounding galaxy experienced a complete breakdown of natural law. The normally composed academic body resembled a support group for beings whose fundamental understanding of existence had been gently but thoroughly demolished by someone who treated cosmic forces like household appliances. Professor Zinthal 9 stood before a holographic display showing the afternoon sensor readings, each data point representing another small death of scientific certainty. "Colleagues," he began, his voice carrying the weight of someone delivering a eulogy for objective reality, "we have reached what I believe the humans would call a teachable moment, though I suspect we are the ones being taught." The lunch break incident had escalated beyond mere academic concern into what the Institute's crisis management protocols classified as existential emergency. The human engineer had visited the cafeteria's quantum food synthesizers, and upon discovering they were running low on antimatter fuel had offered to help. Her solution involved convincing the synthesizers that they contained more energy than they actually did, which worked with the kind of cheerful efficiency that made senior physicists question their career choices. The food replicators were now operating at 200% efficiency while somehow using negative energy input. The cafeteria staff had initially panicked until they realized the machines were producing better meals than ever before, complete with molecular gastronomy effects that violated several laws of chemistry but tasted absolutely delicious. The head chef, a pragmatic Voltairean, had simply shrugged and started planning menus around their newfound ability to synthesize flavors that mathematically could not exist. Dr. Quantum Flux had been monitoring the situation from a safe distance of several probability states when the engineer noticed his flickering existence. "You look unstable," she had observed with genuine concern.
Have you tried existing more confident? Before anyone could stop her, she had made a small adjustment to the local quantum field that somehow convinced his wave function to collapse into a more comfortable configuration. Dr. Quantum Flux now existed with the kind of certainty that violated the uncertainty principle while making him feel better than he had in decades. Helix Prime, whose consciousness normally existed as a distributed probability cloud, had managed to condense enough to speak coherently despite her ongoing identity crisis. The human appears to operate under the assumption that universal constants are negotiable, she reported, her voice carrying overtones of mathematical despair. She has somehow convinced the electromagnetic force to be more cooperative during equipment repairs and has established what can only be described as a friendship with entropy. The evidence was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. The human engineer treated physics the way most species treated social customs, as flexible guidelines that could be adapted to circumstances with proper etiquette. She spoke to fundamental forces with the same tone others used for asking directions, and the universe responded with the eager helpfulness of a cosmic customer service department. Professor Graviton had attempted to explain the immutable nature of space-time curvature, complete with mathematical proofs that had taken her species 3 millennia to develop. The human had listened attentively, then asked if anyone had tried simply asking space-time to curve a bit more efficient. When Graviton had explained that space-time was not a conscious entity capable of receiving requests, the engineer had looked genuinely surprised and mentioned that human space-time had always been quite responsive to polite communication. The revelation that humans had apparently domesticated their local physics created a crisis that threatened the very foundation of galactic scientific authority. If fundamental forces could be negotiated with rather than calculated around, then every equation, every law, every carefully constructed theory became merely one possible interpretation among men. The implications were staggering enough to make several faculty members request emergency sabbaticals to reconsider their life choices. Assistant Professor Neutron Spin had volunteered to test the boundaries of human impossibility by challenging the engineer to demonstrate controlled faster-than-light information transfer. Standard physics demanded that information could not travel faster than light without violating causality, creating paradoxes that would unravel the logical structure of reality itself. The human had agreed enthusiastically, pulled out what looked like a standard communication device, and proceeded to have a real-time conversation with someone on Earth, approximately 47 light-years away. The conversation had been mundane enough to be deeply unsettling, checking on the status of a repair project, asking about weather conditions, and confirming dinner plans with what was apparently a family member. The complete absence of time lag had been disturbing enough, but the casual nature of the communication suggested that humans treated instantaneous interstellar conversation as roughly equivalent to calling the house next door. When questioned about the mechanism, the engineer had explained that the device worked by asking space to deliver messages quickly, please. The technical specifications when pressed involved something about quantum entanglement being more reliable when you're polite about it, and communication networks that operated on principles of cosmic courtesy rather than relativistic constraint. The Institute's most sophisticated monitoring equipment had confirmed the impossible information traveling instantaneously across interstellar distances without any detectable medium, energy expenditure, or causal paradox. The messages simply arrived at their destination at the exact moment they were sent, as if the universe had developed an efficient mail service that operated outside the constraints of physics. By the end of the afternoon session, 3 professors had requested immediate retirement, 2 had entered voluntary isolation to reconsider their understanding of reality, and 1 had begun a philosophical correspondence course in non-Euclidean basket weave. The human engineer, meanwhile, had fixed 17 pieces of advanced equipment that had been broken for years, improved the efficiency of the Institute's power grid by asking it to try harder, and accidentally created a stable micro-wormhole while attempting to organize her tool. The wormhole was roughly the size of a dinner plate, and connected the storage closet to what appeared to be a parallel dimension where all the missing laboratory equipment had been waiting patiently for someone to retrieve. The engineer had apologized for the mess and offered to close it, but the Institute's facilities management had requested it remain open for practical storage purposes. Professor Xanthael 9 stood in the empty auditorium after the human had left for the day, surrounded by the debris of his carefully constructed lesson plan, and the lingering evidence that everything he thought he knew about physics might be charmingly naive. The equations of universal law still glowed on the walls,
but they now seemed less like absolute truth and more like ancient poetry, beautiful, meaningful, and utterly disconnected from how the universe actually operated when humans were involved. Tomorrow's lesson was scheduled to cover the absolute impossibility of perpetual motion machines and the sacred nature of entropy. Professor Zunthael 9 suspected it would be another learning experience, though he was no longer certain who would be doing the learning. The Hegemony Institute of Universal Physics had weathered galactic wars, dimensional incursions, and the occasional theoretical paradox that threatened to unravel local space-time. But nothing in its 4,000-year history had prepared it for the wholesale revision of reality that followed the human engineer's third day of education. The morning had begun with Professor Zunthael 9's carefully planned lecture on entropy and the heat death of the universe, and had concluded with the discovery that humans had apparently negotiated an extended warranty with thermodynamics. The engineer had listened attentively to the explanation of how entropy always increased, how energy always flowed from hot to cold, and how the universe was inexorably winding down toward maximum disorder. She had nodded thoughtfully throughout the presentation, occasionally making notes in a language that seemed to consist entirely of engineering diagrams and cheerful observation. When asked if she had any questions about the inevitable thermal equilibrium of all existence, she had raised her hand and asked if anyone had tried explaining to entropy that it was being rather pessimistic. The subsequent demonstration had involved her toolkit's thermal regulators, which she revealed operated by encouraging heat to flow more creatively. Within minutes she had created a closed system where energy flowed uphill, entropy decreased on command, and the local temperature differential had become so confused it started spelling out words in thermodynamic script. The Institute's monitoring systems had finally given up and begun displaying error messages that roughly translated to "We have no idea what's happening, but it seems friendly." The Faculty Council's emergency vote had been unanimous, though the nature of the unanimity had shifted somewhat from their original intention. Rather than educating the human about proper physics, they had formally voted to establish the human exception principle as a new fundamental constant of the universe. The principle stated in carefully diplomatic language that human engineering operated according to physical laws that were apparently more flexible than previously understood, and that attempting to reconcile human technology with standard physics led to significant faculty mental health concerns. The Institute's Board of Regents had ratified the decision with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency usually reserved for academic crises. The new physics curriculum would include mandatory courses in alternative approaches to universal constants, practical applications of polite science, and advanced studies in cosmic negotiation. The human engineer had been offered a permanent faculty position, complete with tenure, a research budget, and a specially reinforced laboratory that could contain the inevitable reality distortions that followed her work. Professor Zunthael 9 found himself appointed as her first graduate student, a role reversal that would have been humiliating if it had not been so desperately necessary. His new research project involved learning to communicate effectively with fundamental forces, starting with basic courtesy protocols and progressing toward advanced diplomatic relations with the strong nuclear force. His preliminary attempts had been awkward but promising. Gravity had agreed to reduce local field strength by 3% during his first polite request, though it had taken several minutes of careful explanation about academic research needs. The transformation of galactic physics education had proceeded with the kind of inevitable momentum that suggested the universe had been waiting for someone to finally ask it to be more reasonable. Other academic institutions had begun sending delegations to observe the new teaching methods, particularly after reports surfaced that the Institute students were learning to perform impossible engineering feats by treating physics as a collaborative, rather than authoritarian discipline. The human engineer had embraced her new role with the same casual competence she brought to everything else, establishing office hours where she taught alien students how to troubleshoot malfunctioning equipment by talking to it encouragingly, and how to improve experimental results by asking the universe to please be more cooperative. Her advanced seminars in applied cosmic courtesy had a waiting list that extended across 3-star systems. The irony was not lost on the more philosophically inclined faculty members that humanity's greatest contribution to galactic science was not new technology or revolutionary theories, but rather the radical concept that the universe might be willing to negotiate. Thousands of years of treating physical laws as immutable barriers had apparently been unnecessary, when simple politeness could achieve the same results with significantly less mathematics. Professor Zunthale 9 stood in his newly renovated laboratory, watching his latest experiment proceed with the kind of smooth efficiency that came from asking quantum mechanics to please behave predictably for the duration of the research project. The universe, it seemed, was far more accommodating than anyone had imagined, provided one approached it with proper respect and the occasional thank you note. The Hegemony Institute of Universal Physics had discovered that the most fundamental law of all was not conservation of energy or the speed of light, but rather that reality responded remarkably well to being treated as a cooperative partner rather than a problem to be solved. It was a lesson that would reshape galactic civilization, though it had taken a human engineer with a toolkit and a cheerful disregard for impossibility to teach it. The cosmos, apparently, had been waiting for someone to finally ask nicely,